Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are very happy to have you here. I'm Rahul Putty, and I'm going to be in conversation with Professor Peggy Mohan, who is a linguist, who is a writer, and above all, like a woman with many interests. It's my absolute privilege to be having this conversation with her on indenture literature. And before I get started, I would like to know from the audience, because I'd like to keep it slightly interactive right from the beginning. For all of you, how many of you know what indenture means? Please raise your hands. No? Okay, you know what it means. I see a young girl there raising their hands to say what it means. But perhaps we might want to start with that, because I think that would set the tone for what we have to discuss further. Okay, so indenture literature, that's the session that we will be talking. And Dr. Peggy Mohan, it's my absolute privilege to be sharing this platform with you.
Thank you. Does this work? Yeah.
Yes. And as we have had the occasion to converse a little while earlier, I'm very familiar with your work, and therefore it's also personally a very happy moment for me to be sharing this platform with you. So indenture literature, it is as like a word that has come into existence and which seems to have acquired a specificity of its own. But you have been observing this field for a while, and if you were to point out to some key shifts and continuities in what we term as indenture literature, that would be wonderful.
Okay. The word indenture, very often it gets highlighted in other parts of the diaspora, and people use words like girmitia, which comes from the word agreement, and to describe us, because once upon a time, a good more than 120 years ago, that was what we were. But it's a very strange thing to hold on to as an identity. So in Trinidad, we don't. I'm from Trinidad, and we talk of ourselves in terms of our connection with India as Jahajis. And the Jahajis were the people who went on the boats. So we are more interested in the boat as our link to India than the legal bond which made us laborers, replacing African slaves on the estates. So in fact, one of the things I thought I would start with is using the word Jahaji. Somebody saw me upload a picture a few days ago of a paratha, which looks very much like a Malabar paratha. And in fact, I uploaded one last night, and my cousin in the West Indies immediately said, "Oh, they have it too." And I said, "Yes, we all have it wherever the big ships went with white flour." And so it's a connection between us which has more to do with the big ships than to do with indenture agreements. And so I thought that it's one good way of starting to see that we are connected, because we are all people who were serviced by the big ships and who used something that did not grow in our land, which is wheat, and wheat which was imported via the ships. So the Kerala paratha and what I've started calling it the Jahaji paratha, because they want a name for it, and we don't have a name for it. We just call it a paratha. I have never seen any other kind when I was a child, and I come here and I see it again. So it's a Jahaji paratha. So in a way, instead of indenture, I use the word Jahaji, and when I wrote my book, I feminized it, because I was looking at that very unusual situation where women migrated. And this is a matrilineal part of India where it's an understanding that languages and cultural continuity only come when women travel and set down roots. So Jahaji, Mathrubhumi, and all these things come together, and your paratha, in terms of the literature, more than the old notion of bondage.
That's wonderful, because this is something which I think would be very characteristic about your work on your own novel, which is jahajin. And you said like this was the feminine form that you have
Made up.
made up. Otherwise, the word is jahaji,
Yeah.
the
it's
shipfarers.
A
or
not
jahaz.
just a shipfarer. A jahaji was somebody who, having been on the same ship as you, since you no longer had a village, you no longer had a caste in India, you belong to the same community, and therefore you shouldn't marry each other, in fact, because now you were the same people. Because if only one person from a particular caste was coming, who would that person marry? Well, not your jahaji, but someone else.
Yes.
Yeah. Another ship.
And historically speaking, would it be fair to assume or like understand that the jihadis or that we refer to are very specifically these group of laborers in the late 19th century and not the ones earlier? Or
No, we basically had the Indian migration to, and there was some, in fact, when I first wrote my book and I took it to an editor, she said, one of these persons has a Malayali name. I said, she may have, I don't know. She did say she migrated via Chennai, but it doesn't mean she was from Tamil Nadu. But anyone who went would be from that migration. However, until 1860, there were pretty much only men going. And as my new thing I'm saying, men don't have children by themselves. Men need women in order to have children. And until Indian women started going on the Jahaji migration in around the mid-1860s, you couldn't say we had a community as such. We just had a bunch of men who probably worked to death. Or if they ever escaped, or if they ever survived, any children they had would not be Indian children. They would be whoever their mothers were, local people. Hello, you take mine if you have a problem.
yes. And now it seems to be fine again. Okay, get the hands up. But speaking of, and you say that the most interesting aspect of the migration towards the late 19th century was the fact that a lot of women started accompanying the men, but there could be more nuances to that, and where I think this is what you try to bring out in your novel, single women.
Yes. In fact, that's interesting that it never got to be more than 30% women, because women by nature don't migrate. In fact, all the big migrations into India, which my other book lately says, have been men. And if women came, they came only when things were set up. We can see it with our own families going to, well, I look the way I do because my father was a single Indian boy migrating to Canada to college, and there were no girls. So that generation very often did marry locally, because that's the age at which you are interested in getting married. So there is a lot of that. But Indian women went on the migration, and the other thing that was unusual about these women is very rarely were they married to the person they were going with. Many women were either running away from an arranged marriage. My great-great-great-grandmother was thrown out as a widow with her 3 children from Ayodhya, of all places, and went on the longest banvas, and it's all the resonances are there with names straight out of the Ramayana, because everybody had them. It's not so strange to have a name like Sita or Ram. Everybody has that kind of a name. So a lot of the women who went on the migration were free women in the sense that they were not married. And if they did end up on the end of the voyage married, it was to somebody they had only met maybe just before the voyage. So it was a real new start. It wasn't families relocating from India. It was men and there was women, and they were separate. And not more than 30%, because with great effort, offering bribes, women were encouraged to go. And things were difficult in those days in India. Either there were famines or there were droughts. But there was also the issue that this was a community that often migrated. So the women often saw their husbands migrating, but they themselves didn't. And now all of a sudden there was an incentive. They were paid extra if they recruited, because they knew that if there were no women going, the community was not going to replenish itself.
Right, very, very fascinating and insightful. And this meant that during this period you had people, you had a certain kind of regrouping from different parts of India, and but there was then definitely a shift from what I understand, that okay, earlier you had more and more people from the south, and then we had people from the north, and slightly tilting towards, you know, like Basti and the regions of northern India. And was that because of a particular reason that you had more people now, the Bhojpuri speaking regions of India now being part of this Jihadin migration?
Well, let's see. First, the first people to migrate were Malayalis, but that was in fact only, I think, to Mauritius, and that was even before slavery was over. So they were the first to get on the boats. The French tended to look for Tamils, and in fact later Malaysia looked for Tamils, because all of the Bhojpuris were booked by the people sending to sugar plantations. I think whoever got in there decided that I can control this region, and the Bhojpuri area was very useful because it contained people who migrated anyway. So the notion of migration was not a strange thing for them. And also they were farmers, whereas if you go for the first person you find near the port of Calcutta or Madras, you're likely not to find a farmer. You're likely to find someone who will not fit in well, who will not enjoy or take advantage of what could be an opportunity. So as they kept going further and further inland in North India, they encountered this community which had always been migrating, and that too only the men. And suddenly there was an incentive with bad times and other things, like I told you, my great-great-great-grandmother being thrown out of the house. What do? You have 3 little children, and suddenly somebody's offering you a chance to go to the Caribbean, and you take it. You don't know where it is, you don't know that you'll never be back. And some people, some of us, when we got onto the ship, regarded it as an opportunity. Many did not, but many more did think of it as an opportunity. And in fact, V.S. Naipaul's grandfather, when he came back, he brought a young girl with him, unknown to his family. And when he died in India, and she remained here, she was miserable because she felt she had no way of going back. Whereas somebody like me, a much later time, have the opportunity to go back and don't want to. I mean, I'm a reverse migrant back to India. Yeah,
yeah. So we had, as you mentioned, like we have a different group now in the process of migrating, and these are people who have been historically mobile. And this was at the port of departure was Kolkata, from where it would go all the way around to Cape of Good Hope, to South Africa, and then end up in the Caribbean. But perhaps just for the benefit of the audience here, we are talking about this system, this agreement to have laborers sent to the Caribbean. This was a particularly species, like arrangement that came about with the British, and not with other colonial powers in India at that time.
I think the French had something. Is this working?
No.
Hello. Where does this thing work from? Yeah. Can you hear me now? This is getting a little bit much. Okay. Strangely, the French had. the French had some kind of an option to take people from India too. Yeah, the French seemed to have an option, and they did take people to Martinique, Guadeloupe, Mauritius. To that extent, was it French, was it English? I don't know, because it seems to be a bit of both. But in the sense, what's the question in the sense of? Go ahead. Just get another mic, I think.
Hello.
Yeah.
I'm not touching it except this.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me rewind a little. Yeah, so with this group of people, the new group of people that were identified as being always historically mobile, the Bhojpuri speaking community, and these were people who came under this agreement of being sent to the Caribbean, particularly during the late 19th century under the British, and this was the agreement of sorts.
Yes.
What was the agreement exactly?
Okay, the agreement basically was to be for a number of years that they worked on the estates, and it tended to be always more, because I looked at my great-great-grandmother's agreement. She went as a 12-year-old child with her father and brothers. It should have been for 10 years or 5 years, but hers it says 11 point something years. So they wanted to keep you for as long as possible, with all sorts of excuses that you needed training at the end and so on. Because you see, the estate owners in the sugar growing areas, they'd had slaves before, and that was captive labor. They didn't understand that you could possibly run an estate with free labor. So they wanted the Indians initially bound in some way. The funny thing they learned as soon as Indians were freed is that they could use the great modern economic system and give them seasonal work and make them tied up in debts, so they would have to come back anyway. So a large number did, and but it took time for the planters to evolve in their thinking and start working with people who they bound in much more economic ways than legal ways.
And this meant like you're making that big step, crossing the Kalapani, the big moment, which like for many reasons, historical reasons, was always seen as something taboo. But these were people who were convinced that it meant, like going away and perhaps not coming back.
See, I don't know about, you see, we all know about the Kalapani taboo and that you're crossing the water. I don't know that they were actually thinking about it so much when they got on the ship. They knew only when they really saw the magnitude of the ocean and there was nothing but sea, that they would never be back in India in their lifetimes. One thing that, if there is a place which to them was the watershed, the difference between India and the West, it's at the bottom of Africa, where the entire tides, the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans collide. And that is a very big problem, because if you are not a seasoned sailor, you'll be terribly seasick, because the ocean tides are going against each other. They're driving up waves that we have seen from satellite images. They can go up to 100 feet in height. There are a number of those boats that went to the bottom. We don't know how many they were. If they're coming at you and it's 100 feet and your boat is less than 100 feet, you're going down. And these were people who had no idea of this happening, except that they were confined below decks at that time. But so there is that moment, and you always hear of people born on the ship. That is the traumatic moment when a woman might go into labor out of sheer fright. And there were babies born around that time with names like Tufani, meaning storm, and all which link to this.
Very interesting. And when we see these people leaving and who are going to be now in the Caribbean, and we're now talking of now significant linguistic groups who have a certain homogeneity, but now they are going to be resettled in a new land. And these were themes that were explored in earlier works, what we may term as indenture literature. Were these themes of, of the linguistic communities, of women, addressed in, in fiction that we may term as indenture literature. And in this regard, how does your work, Jahajin, what would make it, what other perspectives did it try to incorporate?
I find that a lot of the people who write, except for those who wrote immediately, who were literate when they came from India, there were some men. And they wrote bitterly because if you're literate in India, you wouldn't enjoy the idea of being bonded to anybody. So they had a very different take. And so their work is in that time, around the turn of the 19th century. But later than that, we tend to get a lot of women writing. And where mine will differ is that mine fed out of actually doing research for my thesis and my dissertation and various other projects after. That who do you talk to if you want to learn about the language? And this is one thing that we get to know as we get older, is that women live longer than men, and that the men are gone, and the men are living in the here and now about their medical conditions or their whatever issues are here facing them, politics. That's what they want to talk about. They don't talk about the past, the few who are still there. Whereas women live on, and they tend to be in groups. They reinforce each other's stories. So whenever I would get to hear people tell me their tales of the past or their folk tales, which were about migration also, I found that they always had a circle of friends, mostly female, who encouraged them, and they fine-tuned and edited their stories. And in the course of editing their stories about the past, one thing they did is take out the negative things. We were never told that bad things happened. They were glossed over unless they were very bad, but we in the end had won in some way. So when I see modern diaspora literature, modern, I would call Jahaji literature, I find a lot of young women who have relocated to the US and Canada, and they have faced their own problems of being migrants, racism, things that are not forefront in the mind of the old Jahajis. The Jahajis knew it, but over time, as they talked and refined their stories, refined the language, brought it all into some form of cohesion, that they all sounded a bit alike, they took out the negative things and the negative memories. So when I went to them, I got that slant, that things had happened, but that we were on estates, but we were the only people who mattered. There were other people, there were white people, but but they did not matter. We mattered. We were continuing our village life in India in some way. There were Africans there, but everyone was on the periphery and only Indians mattered, which is another way of recasting your history in a way that gives you strength for the future, that you are the most important and that your journey is a continuing journey. Whereas the others whose journey continued into Canada, the US, Britain, they had other problems, and they imagined that this was what the old people on the estates were thinking about. Maybe they were, because I know in my family, when I was growing up, we were not more than 10 kilometers from the estate that my family had been to. I was told the name of it, I was told some of the stories, but were never taken to see it. I went there once as a child to a birthday party with my mother and lined up with the other children with no notion that this was a place that we had been bonded to. And it's ironic to sit on the steps of a white estate owner's place, his house, his bungalow, and be taken a picture of, and not to have the family insist that go and see this tree, go and see this building, we were here, we were there. it's only after my book came out that an uncle who was from the other brother, two brothers came, one died on the ship, that I had an idea of any link to this place, that I had family still there. We had moved away from it, we had looked on, and we had tried to be positive, which is probably why in Trinidad, those of us who get our story from there don't talk of being indentures anymore. We talk of being jahajis.
Yeah, this kind of a metamorphosis is something very, very interesting.
Okay, in fact, a story.
Yes. Yeah. It's a story of metamorphosis, and that's what I understood. Yeah?
Saranga story.
The Saranga story, exactly, this transformation, something that happens. And there is, as I understand from what you also just said, that this was born out of your own work, which had your entry point was through language. You were researching about the Bhojpuri language at the time, and one of the most important sources of data that you needed for your work, and that you wanted to have it as the oral folklore that still remained amongst the speakers of Bhojpuri in Trinidad then. Yeah?
Yeah, in fact, one of the strands of the book is a folk tale that they told, and the tale is about a little monkey, a lady monkey, who left her mate behind and crossed a river. And the whole idea of crossing water and being transformed, and therefore she became human, and he had to struggle to get into the same kind of cycle of births. He had to be born again to become human. And the idea that this is the most well-known of our stories is about a transformation because of crossing water, and nobody really thinking about it consciously. It's just a very interesting, very long story. It's our own story, because we also, when we crossed the water and went to the Caribbean, we became the kind of people who could sit at a lit fest now rather than go and cut your grass for you in your homes. It's a very important point that when people ask me why I do speak my language, but there's an etiquette. If I were to speak to my gardener in this language, his ambitions and my ancestors' ambitions are gone. We must speak in Hindi, because if we speak in our village dialect, we are undoing all the things that took us forward to where we are now. Like, I think looking at me, the first thing that comes to your mind is not that I'm a bonded laborer in India. There has been that transformation. That's what this story is, that folk tale, that the little monkey who became human, and immediately a prince says, I want this as my wife. So clearly the bravery, the courage of this creature to cross water when the stars were right, actually that's how the story starts, catches the idea that these women too did something unprecedented. Indian woman, no female animal likes to migrate, but they did. And when they did, they created a whole new world.
They created a whole new world. And this was, and the material for these notions to emerge were always in the language, and it was so central because that's where they said, like, if there was one reason for Bhojpuri to emerge as a language, as a lingua franca in Trinidad, was because of the fact that you had women migrating, and as I understood from the novel Jahajin, that it was also the concept of community child rearing, and then where you had by and large a woman who would spend time with the children while the mothers and men went to work, and so you had somebody speaking to those children in that language.
Yeah, in fact, I'm not perfectly sure. We can't go back into the past and know these things, but I'm guessing, and when I had to write dialogue in the book, I showed people who spoke a little differently when they were in India, starting to speak the way the average person spoke on the estate. There's something, I think, in linguistics called a founder effect, which basically means the first people who go somewhere theirs is the image that sticks. So if you happen to be from a particular part of the Bhojpuri area, that's the Bhojpuri that stays in the country. I don't have all the answers. How did they meet each other when they were on separate estates? How did slaves meet each other? That was even much more tightly bound, but somehow single languages came up. And I still don't know the answer to that, because these people would not have been allowed to meet. There were laws that kept them stuck on the estate, but somehow it happened.
And and there is a different understanding of Bhojpuri in Trinidad, because, and this is what, again, I think I found this passage in your book particularly interesting. It says, in Trinidad we think of Bhojpuri as one language. In India they think of it as a chain of dialects. And this is, this colors the way how we work with information or data. That's data because it's in the context of the novel. It's about the researcher there.
See, it's interesting. This term I have a bunch of students from Maharashtra in my class on linguistics. And one of them mentioned that, it's very strange. Every part of Maharashtra is a little bit different. And I tried to say, but that's what's normal. Everywhere being the same. And I have a girl from Kerala also, and I asked her, isn't that the case in Kerala, that everybody thinks they speak a little differently, but we understand each other, which is something much older than the idea that the school system has given you only one way of speaking. But in the time I've been in India, which is, approximately 44 years. I've been here longer than many of you have been alive. In 44 years I've been in India, my own language has changed, and people in India speak more like me than they did when I came, because it's become a language that's used in pop culture, in politics, a bit in journalism, other things like that, a bit of literature. So the idea is you can't be just talking your one village dialect which no one else understands. So it's been coming together, and I've at times stood on platforms like this with people like Lalu Prasad and found that he doesn't sound very different from me. And that would not have been the case 44 years ago. So what has happened to us, I often talk of us as the advanced party. What's going to happen to India soon in terms of its poorer people is what happened to us. So we are a glimpse of, like when I look at little Indian children now, how they dress, how they do their hair, when they go to school, and so that's how we looked when I was a child. So it's like we are 40 years glimpse of how the poor of India will look in 40 years' time.
And with regards to the language in present-day Trinidad itself, it's one of the largest, and it has the status of a minority language. But of course, as I see from the number of speakers, it's the largest minority language. However, problematic these definitions often are.
Bhojpuri?
Bhojpuri, yeah, and we have present-day generation, and it's only normal that the Bhojpuri they speak is something. Is it something from very different from the women who still carry those stories, and this is
not that different.
And this is not creolization. I think that's what you wish to make clear.
No, it was not.
Yeah.
It wasn't something Caribbean that happened to us. It was something internal. Languages, if for example, you suddenly find yourself ordinary Malayalis, ordinary Hindi speakers, ordinary people from Andhra, etc., Northeast, all thrown together, you will find a funny fusion taking place. And there's not much fusion that has to happen because the grammars are already in line. You'll just take a lot more English words. That kind of thing can happen. But we didn't even need to do that in Bhojpuri. We had the same words. We essentially had the same grammar. Just a little cute details needed to be thrown out so that we all seemed to sound a bit alike. But that was then. What is lost to a lot of people is how much we've changed in that we've become people like me who are very happy speaking English. So I am the only one in my generation who still speaks the language. And so I'm really one of the last dodo birds in the Caribbean. So even my daughter, when she went back with me, she was stunned to hear me speak it because she'd only heard very poor people in India speaking the way I spoke. Now, if I was to speak like that now in India, you might hire me to sweep your floors. You would not hire me as a professor of linguistics. So in a way, we don't regard the transformation as a very bad thing. It's bad for the language in that it should have evolved with us. It should have come into the academic system, the university world, and so it didn't happen. But we have survived, and we have gotten many, many, many more opportunities, and maybe that's not, we don't think that's a bad thing.
That's a very positive note on which I would like to also come back to the theme of indenture literature, and perhaps is this the reason that why we have is in the last few decades that you have a kind of consciousness about when we talk about writers from Trinidad and all that, this new consciousness and this fact of reverse migration and the way then we and many more other migrations have happened in the meantime, all this shaping the kind of stories then that we begin to say or narrate. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It's obviously an ongoing story, and one of the things I said in my book is that our journey didn't end. It had to continue through whatever we were. My caste would have been goldsmiths, so we got into tech very easily because goldsmiths like tech. It didn't happen in India, but it could happen in the Caribbean, and then from that go into something as esoteric as linguistics. So it's an ongoing journey until we reach where? Where's the top of the world? In a way, I would say that the great-great-great-grandmother who left from Ayodhya would not have imagined that long, long down the line, one generation down from me, is the head of Google search. My daughter.
Yeah,
and that could not happen unless there was transformation all the way. A research for Google search, she would correct me. This is a huge, and it's all women I'm looking at, and how we have changed in all this time from the old woman who came on the ship, got a job looking after the children on the estate, so she herself didn't have to be a laborer because she had never been in India, and her children moving on through channels that were old, tech being, now it's very strange that tech, as in being a village jeweler in India, goes on to being part of Silicon Valley now. My daughter would be shocked to hear me talk about her in this, but this is where it's a long journey, and it doesn't end with just reaching at the end of the ship voyage.
It's been a very fascinating journey of words with you, Dr. Peggy Mohan.